There are 3 universities founded by the Society of Mary in the United States. They are Chaminade University in Hawaii, the imaginatively named St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and the University of Dayton. The one in Dayton was founded first in 1850 as St. Mary's College. It was still called St. Mary's in 1908 when some students decided to start a basketball team called St. Mary's Cadets. The cadets were successful enough that, in the autumn of 1913, they organised a football team. They went on to win 2 Dayton City Championships and the Southern Ohio Championship in the ensuing years, until in 1916, they were reorganised as a company team based around 3 factories in downtown Dayton: the Domestic Engineering Company, the Dayton Metal Products Company, and Delco, renaming themselves the Dayton Triangles in the process. After winning the Ohio League Championship in 1918, they became charter members of the American Professional Football Association, which in 1922 changed its name to the National Football League. On the 3rd of October 1920, in front of a crowd of 4,000, the Dayton Triangles won what is considered the first NFL game 14-0 against the Columbus Panhandles. The game that day was played at Triangle Park, the land for which had been donated by Charles Kettering and Edward Deeds. 48 years, 3 months and 9 days later, Joe Namath would win Super Bowl III with the New York Jets. Their opponents that day were the Baltimore Colts, who traced their lineage back to 1916, when they were known as the Dayton Triangles.
I love refrigerators.
In 1915, a mechanical engineer named Alfred Mellows built something he called a refrigerator in his garage in Detroit, Michigan. He then set up his own company, Guardian Refrigerator, and sold 34 of his refrigerators in the Detroit area between April 1, 1916 and February 28, 1918. Mellows was the company. He built the refrigerators, he serviced the refrigerators, he probably even delivered the refrigerators. It didn't matter. He was hemorrhaging money, and it looked like his fledgling business was a bust. In June 1918, the regrettably named William Crapo Durant, founder of General Motors Company, bought Mellows out for $56,366.50. Durant was worried that due to the United States' entry into the First World War, the government would stifle automobile production and saw refrigeration as an emerging market with potential. GM changed the name upon acquisition from Guardian Refrigerator to the Frigidaire Corporation. Their subsequent efforts to sell and maintain the refrigerators outside of Detroit were an expensive failure. By 1921, GM had lost $2.6 million, $1.1 million of which was unsold stock. The problem was that early refrigerators were terrible and dangerous. All the places you can keep a fridge now are the exact same places you couldn't keep one in the early 1920s. Namely anywhere inside. If it leaked, it would kill you. If it caught fire, it would kill you. If you looked at it funny, it would kill you. A leak in a Cleveland hospital killed over 100 people in 1929. Most hospitals refused to use them on safety grounds. The most common refrigerants used in these early models were ammonia, methyl chloride, butane, and sulfur dioxide. All highly toxic, all a bad idea to have 3 inches from cheese. It wasn't just Frigidaire who was in trouble, it was the entire industry. No other company or organisation, including Frigidaire, had made any quantifiable contribution to research, development, or improvement to production or servicing techniques by the mid-1920s. Kettering, who was by now head of GM's research laboratories, realised that the market potential for safe, practical refrigeration and air conditioning was absolutely enormous, stating, "The possibility of this simple idea is so great that we can hardly begin to visualize the changes it will make." He turned to the man he knew was capable of solving the problem. Midgley had been busying himself since 1925 with research into synthetic rubber, after the price of the natural stuff became so high that many companies felt it practical to find synthetic alternatives. Kettering had to coax him away from his research at Cornell, his old alma mater, to work on the project. Midgley was given a list of 6 requirements for an acceptable refrigerant. They were: 1. To have a suitable boiling point. 2. To be non-poisonous. 3. To be non-flammable. 4. To have a distinct but not unpleasant odour. 5. To be immiscible with lubricating oils. 6. To be relatively inexpensive. Then, in Midgley's words, we took the wallpaper off an old dining room and we papered it with white paper. We then drew the coordinates in there of all the critical pressures and temperatures of all known gases used in refrigerators. Exactly in the middle, where an ideal refrigerant should be, was the element fluorine. It's here where this particular line of inquiry should have ended. Fluorine is both poisonous and corrosive. Midgley knew it. His team knew it. I knew it. The only person in the room who didn't was Midgley's assistant, who by some miracle had recently completed his doctorate under the world's preeminent fluorine chemist. He thought there might be something to it. He was right. Midgley and his team cracked it in a matter of days. What they created was dichlorodifluoromethane, a chlorofluorocarbon, a CFC. Midgley introduced it to the world in 1930 at the April meeting of the American Chemical Society. Already branded as Freon, Midgley huffed a lungful of the compound and blew out a candle to demonstrate how it didn't kill him to death or set him on fire. A beautiful piece of theatre if you're unaware that Freon, when exposed to flame, decomposes into the deadly nerve agent phosgene, a fact which Robert Kehoe assured the authorities was not to be regarded as of great consequence. Freon's impact on the industry was immediate. In 1929, GM manufactured 1 million refrigerators. By 1932, they were making 2.25 million. It was also sold to competitors, so that by the mid-1930s, Freon was used universally as a refrigerant by companies such as Kelvinator, Westinghouse, Norge and General Electric. And its use wasn't just limited to refrigeration. It was also used extensively by the air conditioning industry and as an aerosol propellant in myriad different products. Remember that can of Noxema from the beginning? The one which Farrah Fawcett was using to cream Joe Namath. It was using CFCs as a propellant. In 1973, when that commercial aired, Americans bought around 3 billion aerosol cans, roughly half the global sales. It's difficult to overstate what an impact safe refrigeration had on society. The ability to refrigerate vaccines alone has saved millions of lives. Air conditioning has made sweltering monuments to man's hubris like Dubai and Phoenix livable for millions. The accolades rolled in for Midgley. He was awarded chemistry's 4 highest honours: the Perkin Medal, the Priestley Medal, the Willard Gibbs Medal, and the Nichols Medal. He'd reached the peak of his profession, and it had made him a wealthy man. He returned home every evening to an 80-acre estate in Worthington, Ohio, the main property modelled after George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation house. He had the freedom to pursue any avenue of research he pleased. And then it was all over. In the autumn of 1940, after a meeting with the Detroit branch of the American Chemical Society, he had lunch at the Oakland Hills Country Club in Birmingham, Michigan. He complained of feeling ill and had his chauffeur, who'd driven him the 200 miles to Detroit, immediately take him back to Ohio. When he woke up the next morning, he was paralysed from the waist down. Midgley calculated that the chances of a man his age catching polio were substantially equal to drawing a jack of hearts from a stack of playing cards as tall as the Empire State Building. He never recovered. There's a disconcertingly long list of people who've been removed from the world by something they brought into it. The earliest example, according to legend, was Perilos of Athens, who upon presenting his brazen bull to Phalaris of Sicily, was promptly thrown inside to give a demonstration of how it worked. One of the more recent examples is Mike Hughes, a flat earther who built and flew his own steam-powered rockets and died near Barstow on the edge of the desert when its parachute failed to take hold. Whether he felt lightheaded and thought someone else should drive is unknown. William Bullock invented the Webb rotary printing press. During the installation of a new machine in Philadelphia, his foot was crushed. Gangrene set in, and he died during the amputation. Luis Jimenez died in 2006 when part of his blue Mustang statue, the one which small children shit themselves at the sight of when arriving at Denver International Airport, fell on him and severed an artery in his leg. My favourite was Franz Reichelt, who fell from the first deck of the Eiffel Tower testing a coat parachute he invented. This was him testing it for the very first time. Thomas Midgley Jr. would join this list on November 2, 1944. He'd been fiercely independent of mind his entire life and wanted to remain independent of body too, despite his paralysis. He created a harness and a system of pulleys that he could strap himself into and lift himself from his bed to his wheelchair, like a Rube Goldberg machine for getting you up in the morning. He became tangled in the pulley system and strangled himself to death. He was 55. It would be another 2 decades before we even began to understand the implications of his life's work. It was 1948, and Claire Patterson was geologically aging zircons. A zircon looks like the kind of thing a villain in a Marvel movie has travelled halfway across the galaxy to find, and Claire Patterson, despite the image you probably have in your head, was a lanky, bespectacled man. Zircons are perfect to use for geological dating because when they form, they contain small amounts of uranium but no lead. Therefore, if any lead is present, it must have come from the decay of uranium, and since we know the exact rate at which uranium decays, the ratio of uranium to lead in the zircon will give us its age. Patterson knew all about uranium. He spent the end of the Second World War at a secret nuclear facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enriching the stuff. Upon discovering it had been used to turn 2 Japanese cities into radioactive car parks, he decided to return to civilian life and pursue something more constructive. Patterson's ultimate goal at the time was to calculate the age of the Earth. There was just one small problem. His samples were utterly out of whack. Just way off. There was 200 times more lead in them than could be reasonably expected. He had absolutely no idea where it was coming from, but knew that if he wanted an accurate number for the age of the Earth, he would have to devise a way of ridding himself and his samples of the stuff. It was everywhere. In the test tubes, on the floor, in his hair, on the walls. It was like it was in the air itself. His response to the problem was entirely in keeping with his character. Zealous, obsessive, and extreme. He stripped off, scrubbed, mopped, and vacuumed. He triple distilled his own water. He had the entire building replumbed, then when he found out lead solder was used in electrical connections, had it rewired. He covered work surfaces in parafilm and built small laminar flow hoods inside the laminar flow hoods he already had. Even the Pyrex went through a 5-stage cleaning process. There was no compromise in Patterson. The end result was a lead-free lab, the world's first clean room, and the number he'd been searching for: 4.5 billion years. After one of the greatest scientific achievements of the 20th century, Patterson set himself the new challenge of finding out more about Earth's history, specifically the evolution of the Earth's crust and mantle and the formation of continents. He began testing ocean sediments and water columns off both coasts of the US. When he got his samples back to the lab, he was faced with a familiar problem: lead. There was 20 times more lead in the water near the surface than in the deep, old water near the ocean floor. After crunching the numbers on all the possible natural causes of high oceanic lead, such as forest fires and volcanoes, Patterson realized that the only source left was human activity. He figured there could be 100 times more lead in mid-20th century humans than there should be. When he decided to publish his findings, the oil and petrochemical industry swiveled to face him like Sauron's eye. Patterson was in the unenviable position of biting the hand that was feeding him. Since the mid-50s, the oil industry had funded his research to the tune of $200,000. The American Petroleum Institute immediately withdrew its funding. His contract with the Public Health Service wasn't renewed, and the Atomic Energy Commission was asked to stop subsidizing his work. It was your classic common or garden blacklisting. Publicly discrediting his work would only serve to draw attention to it, so they tried to discredit the man instead by implying Patterson was a fruitcake. Patterson was a fruitcake. He wore a gas mask on campus when it was smoggy. His Caltech office had 2 layers of walls, doors, and ceilings. Saul Bellow thought him quirky and eccentric enough to use as a blueprint for the character of Sam Beach in his novel The Dean's December. He liked long-distance running. He was a man called Claire. He was also onto something. Robert Kehoe disagreed. Kehoe had been the director of the Kettering Laboratory of Applied Physiology at the University of Cincinnati since it opened in 1930. It was founded by GM and DuPont, funded by the likes of the Ethel Corporation and Frigidaire, and held a near monopoly on research into lead toxicity. Kehoe had a conflict of interest so massive it generated its own gravity. It was written into his contract. The companies bankrolling his research had the final say on what he was and wasn't allowed to publish. Numbers not quite right? Bury it. Potential to harm our bottom line? Bury it. Possible national scandal, you say? Bury it. Even worse, Kehoe's research, which the world came to rely on as the leading source of information on lead toxicity, wasn't subject to much independent scrutiny or peer review. His mistakes became fact, and some of his mistakes were real bloomers. He figured that human bodies maintained an essential balance of lead by excreting as much as they absorbed from the environment, that the amount of lead in both people and the environment had remained consistent and were therefore natural, that a toxicity threshold for lead poisoning existed whereby anything under 80 micrograms per deciliter of blood was harmless, and that the amounts being ingested by the population were far below this threshold and therefore insignificant. Such was conventional wisdom. There isn't a safe exposure level to lead just as there isn't to asbestos or radiation. It's a cumulative toxicant. You can be subclinically poisoned, mildly poisoned, chronically poisoned, acutely poisoned, and it's particularly harmful to children. As little as 5 micrograms per deciliter are enough to lower a child's IQ. Let's say you were born in the mid-1940s and grew up in a major city in a developed Western country. Oh, I don't know, New York say. Well, there's a good chance your IQ is lower than it would have been due to high atmospheric lead. Kehoe was asked to review Patterson's findings, then he took out his hatchet. It is an example of how wrong one can be. Patterson is so woefully ignorant and so lacking in any concepts of the depths of his ignorance that he is not even cautious in drawing sweeping conclusions. Dr. Patterson has ventured without caution, humility, or appropriate critique into what is clearly, for him, an alien area of biology. Faced with the distinct possibility of being patronized to death, Patterson did precisely what you'd expect someone as uncompromising and extreme to do. He traveled to some of the most uncompromising and extreme environments on the planet in the name of research. In theory, it was simplicity itself. All Patterson needed was snow that didn't melt. The practicalities meant severe cold and serious latitude, which is how, in July 1965, he found himself 140 miles east of Tula in Greenland. The reasoning was sound. Lead is in the snowflakes, it goes down and you have a layer there. Next year you have another one. Each layer is an intact record of what was in the air when the snow came down. They just accumulate like pages in a book. It was this unique property of ice sheets which Patterson was hoping to exploit to compare the lead in ancient ice deeper down with the lead in the fresher stuff near the surface. Once the samples were back at Caltech and analysed, the numbers jumped off the paper. The amount of lead in the atmosphere had risen 400% from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s until 1930. With the introduction of lead in gasoline, it had raised a further 350% from 1930 to 1965. Patterson had his smoking gun, and the petrochemical industry's fingerprints were all over it. This got the attention of Capitol Hill, and in 1966 a hearing before a subcommittee on air and water pollution took place. You can tell the fix was in from the list of witnesses. Speaking on behalf of lead, consultant and former president of the Lead Industries Association, New York, Felix E. Wormser. Speaking on behalf of the environment, political journalist and editor of the Saturday Review, Norman Cousins. Even the list of senators chairing the committee sounds like the world's shittest folk supergroup. Randolph, Muskie, Harris and Boggs. Robert Kehoe, by now so bent out of shape by corporate pressure he probably needed to sleep on a spiral staircase, used the hearing as a stage from which he could show the world where 40 years of junk science and corporate bootlicking get you. He spent his first 30 seconds in front of the committee explaining, politely and diplomatically, that they were too unlettered to understand what he had to say, then spent the rest of his time elaborating on that theme. There was nothing to see here. Go home. It was 1970 before the Clean Air Act bestowed on the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency the power to regulate fuel additives. It would be 1972 before they used that power to propose regulations reducing the amount of lead in petrol. to 60% of its current level by 1977. Then, to add insult to injury, the Ethel Corporation sued the Environmental Protection Agency in 1973. Their argument was the same as Robert Kehoe's in 1925. The science isn't clear, therefore you can't regulate us. They were telling the truth. Most of the labs attempting to independently verify Patterson's findings couldn't because they had no clean room in which to do so. They had no idea their numbers were wrong. Patterson did. When he compared the lead in ancient bones to the bones of the recently deceased, he finally saw the full magnitude of the problem. Remember how the body confuses lead with calcium? Most of the lead inside you right now, Dave in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, is in your bones. Patterson knew that if he could compare the lead to calcium ratio in ancient bones, like he compared the uranium to lead ratio in zircons, he'd know what the natural level of lead was, before all the aqueducts and the lead pipes and the mines and the lead paint and the Ethel. By remarkable coincidence, he obtained 2 of my ex-wives, an Egyptian mummy and a 4,500-year-old Peruvian, and started drilling. Americans, in the 1970s, had 600 times the lead inside them than their ancient ancestors did. Once the EPA regulations kicked in at the end of the 70s, the amount of lead in the atmosphere dropped precipitously, exactly like Patterson and those pleading for regulations said it would. The lead industry kicked and screamed and fought and obfuscated and sued until the end of the 1980s. Until the evidence against their insistence that lead was harmless as an additive became so overwhelming that denying it became an act of corporate canutism. It would be New Year's Day 1996 before leaded gasoline was finally removed from sale in the US.